I was never the kind of man who believed in ghosts. 32 years in homicide had shown me enough of what people were capable of without the help of anything supernatural. But there are some places that remember too much, places that don't let go of what happened inside them. The house on Birch Hollow Road was one of those places. Even after all these years, I can still feel the weight of that winter pressing down on me when I think of it. The silence, the way the snow muffled everything, the way that house seemed to breathe when the wind hit its walls. I'd been retired almost a decade when I started thinking about it again. It began with a dream, not a vivid one, not one of those cinematic visions that people like to talk about. Just a sound. A soft knocking somewhere down the hall, followed by the faint creak of old wood shifting under weight. I woke up to an empty room and the hum of the furnace. But the sound lingered in my head, and by morning I found myself driving north toward the town I'd sworn I'd never visit again. Back then, in winter of '87, it was a quiet place, one of those Midwestern towns that sat like a forgotten dot between cornfields and frozen lakes. People kept to themselves. They trusted their neighbors, but they didn't talk much about what went on behind closed doors. When the call came in about the Holloway family, it didn't stir much noise at first. A triple suicide, a husband, wife, and their teenage son, carbon monoxide poisoning in the dead of winter. I'd seen it before. People get desperate when the world turns gray and the bills keep piling up. But something about that house bothered me from the start. Maybe it was the way the patrol officer's voice trembled over the radio when he described what he'd found. Maybe it was the way he paused before saying the boy's name, like he couldn't bring himself to. I remember the drive up that narrow road, how the snow had turned the trees into pale skeletons, how the sky looked like it was holding its breath. The house stood at the end of a long gravel path, half buried in drifts, 2 stories, peeling white paint, a sagging porch that tilted toward the woods. It looked abandoned even then, but there were tire tracks in the snow, fresh ones leading to the detached garage. The coroner's van was already there, its light spinning faintly against the snow. When I stepped out of the car, the air bit through my coat, sharp and metallic, like breathing in blood. Inside, the first thing that hit me was the silence. No radio, no clock ticking, no pipes humming. Just the faint hiss of the furnace and the low, irregular groan of the old house settling. The Halloways were still where the first responders had found them, seated around the kitchen table, heads bowed, cups of untouched coffee cooling in front of them. The generator in the garage had been left running, its hose fed through a cracked window. No struggle, no sign of forced entry. It looked like a pact, a mutual surrender. But people rarely die that neatly. I remember kneeling beside the boy, Danny was his name, 17 years old. His hands were clasped together like he'd been praying when it happened. But there was something off about his posture. Rigor mortis had set in, but his head was turned slightly toward the window, as if he'd heard something just before the end. I noted it, wrote it down, but I didn't know why it unsettled me so much. Maybe because when I looked through that same window, I thought I saw a faint outline in the snow outside, a single set of footprints leading away from the house toward the tree line. But when I went out later to check, they were gone. The wind had swallowed them whole. We ruled it a suicide within a week. The toxicology matched, the timeline fit, no signs of foul play. The case went cold faster than the bodies did. But even after the file was sealed, I kept thinking about that window, about the way the boy's eyes were open, reflecting something I couldn't see. For years, that house appeared in my dreams, sometimes silent, sometimes whispering through the walls like it was trying to confess something. When I finally went back, it was early January. The road had changed, new developments closer to town, but the last few miles were still unpaved and half frozen. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I told myself it was just curiosity, a need for closure. But I think deep down, I wanted the house to prove me wrong. To show me there was nothing there but wood and dust and old memories. The gate was still there, half collapsed, the old mailbox hanging open like a mouth mid-scream. I parked where I had all those years ago and just sat there, watching my breath fog the windshield. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint had flaked down to raw wood and the porch steps had caved in. The windows were boarded over except for one on the second floor, the same window Danny had been staring toward. A faint light flickered behind it. It could have been a reflection, I told myself, could have been the sun breaking through clouds. But there was no sun that day. The sky was a solid slab of gray. Still, I got out of the car. The snow was deep, almost to my knee. No tracks except my own. The air was so still it felt heavy, like the world was waiting for something. As I reached the porch, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Not much, just enough for the wind to catch it and make it groan against the hinges. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I pushed it open. The smell hit me first, damp wood, rot, and something else underneath, faint but unmistakable. Metal, rust. I stepped inside. The floorboards creaked like bones under my weight. Dust coated everything, thick as ash. But the kitchen, the place where they'd died, was clean. Empty table, no cobwebs, no debris, like someone had been there recently. I stood there listening. The silence was absolute. Then from somewhere upstairs, I heard it, a single, hollow knock. I froze. It came again, softer this time, followed by the faint creak of a floorboard shifting under weight. It was the same sound I'd heard in my dream. I didn't call out, I didn't move. I just listened. 3 knocks this time. Slow, deliberate, evenly spaced, and then silence again. It could have been the house settling. It could have been my imagination. But I remember the exact feeling that crawled up my spine in that moment. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The house was remembering me. I stood there longer than I care to admit, listening to the stillness. The kind that presses against your ears until you start hearing your own blood move. The house had always been quiet, but this silence was different. It felt deliberate, like the air itself was waiting to see what I'd do next. I told myself it was nothing, the cold shifting through the beams, the memory of an old place reacting to weight and wind. But I'd spent too long around death not to know when something was paying attention to me. I took a step toward the staircase. The wood groaned under my boot, and for a brief second I thought I heard another sound in response, a shuffle, almost polite, coming from somewhere above. I waited again, every nerve tuned to the smallest vibration. Nothing. I started up. The stairs were coated in a thin film of dust except for one tread near the top where the wood looked clean, like something had brushed against it recently. I ran a gloved hand along the banister, felt the splinters bite through the leather. At the landing, the hallway stretched in both directions, doors hanging open like dark mouths. I remembered the layout. The master bedroom to the left, the boys' room to the right, bathroom straight ahead. The smell was stronger up here, not rot exactly, but old air trapped too long with whatever memories it carried. I went into the boys' room first. It looked smaller than I remembered, as if the years had folded the walls inward. The wallpaper had peeled away in long vertical strips, revealing the cracked plaster beneath. His bed frame was still there, rusted and bare, and against the far wall, a small desk. I remembered the photographs we'd found in the drawers back then. The family at the county fair, the mother holding a stuffed bear, the father's arm around his son's shoulders. They looked happy in that frozen moment, but I'd learned long ago that happiness in photos is often camouflage. Now the drawers were empty, but there were faint scratches on the wood, dozens of them clustered near the edge, like someone had dragged a blade or a nail over it again and again. I leaned closer. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, short vertical marks grouped in 5s, tally marks. Someone had been counting days. I felt something shift inside me. The official report said the deaths had happened overnight. No sign of restraint, no sign of struggle. But these marks didn't belong to a family planning a quiet exit. They belonged to someone trapped, someone keeping track of time the only way they could. A cold draft moved through the room, soft but definite. I turned toward the window, the same one the boy had been facing when we found him. It was boarded over from the outside now, but light leaked through the cracks, thin and gray. And in that light on the floor beneath it, I saw something faintly shining. I knelt down, a small metal object half buried in dust. I brushed it off with my glove. It was a button, brass worn smooth at the edges, military style, the kind you'd find on an old uniform coat. I remembered cataloging every personal item during the investigation. There'd been nothing like this listed. It didn't belong to the Halloways. I pocketed it before I could think twice. Old habits die hard. Then I noticed something else, footprints in the dust. Small, faint, like the outline of bare feet. They led from the corner of the room toward the hall but stopped abruptly mid-step. The last print ended just beyond the doorway, as if whoever made it had vanished into the air. The skin on the back of my neck tightened. I told myself it was impossible. Dust settles in strange ways. Shadows play tricks. But even as I thought it, I felt the temperature drop a few degrees. I moved toward the master bedroom. The door was half closed, the knob loose in its fitting. I pushed it open with my shoulder. The smell hit me again, stronger this time, metallic and sour. The room was darker, the boards over the window thicker. The bed was gone, only the frame remained, and on the far wall, above where the headboard would have been, a dark stain spread across the plaster like something had seeped through from the other side. I reached out, ran my fingers along the edge of the mark. Dry, decades old, but beneath it the plaster felt soft, uneven, like it had been patched over. I shined my flashlight on it and saw faint outlines beneath the paint, shapes that didn't belong to the wall. Letters, maybe. I took a pocket knife from my coat and scraped gently at the surface. Bits of plaster flaked away, and underneath, written in something dark that had long since turned brown, were 4 words. Don't trust the walls. The words stopped me cold. They were written in a hurried hand, slanted downward, the kind of scrawl someone makes when they're desperate. My first thought was that it was a cruel joke, graffiti from teenagers who'd broken in over the years. But the paint was old, older than the boards. It looked like it had been there since before the house was sealed. I felt the floor creak behind me and turned, expecting to see the doorway empty. It was, but the dust had been disturbed again. A single new footprint beside mine, fresh enough that it hadn't begun to settle. Small Bear pointed toward the hall. I didn't move for a long time, just stood there staring at it, trying to reason through what I was seeing. I even looked up, scanning the ceiling for loose plaster, anything that could have fallen and mimicked the shape, but it was no trick of debris. Someone or something had stepped there. I backed into the hall slowly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I didn't. I went to the end of the corridor instead, where a narrow attic ladder hung from the ceiling. It was half extended, like someone had climbed down and never bothered to push it back up. I hesitated, then pulled it all the way down. Dust fell in sheets. The smell that came from above was stronger still, dry rot, insulation, and something faintly sweet underneath, like old perfume gone sour. I climbed halfway before my flashlight beam caught something on the floorboards above. A box, small and wooden, sitting directly beneath the attic window. I climbed the rest of the way up and crouched beside it. The box was covered in dust but untouched otherwise. No cobwebs, no signs of disturbance. I lifted the lid. Inside were papers, folded and yellowed with age. Letters. The first one was addressed to Officer W. Harker. My name. My throat went dry. Nobody outside the department would have known I'd worked that case, and even if they had, there was no reason for a note like that to exist. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. The ink had bled and faded, but I could still make out the words. You missed something. That was all it said. No signature. No date. I sat there for a long time, the cold from the floorboards seeping through my knees, the house whispering around me as the wind picked up outside. The words echoed in my mind like a verdict. You missed something. After all these years, the case was still talking to me, and now I realized I might finally have to listen. The letter stayed in my hand for a long time before I trusted myself to breathe again. You missed something. 2 words that cut through decades like they'd just been written. I wanted to believe it was an old trick, maybe a leftover from some local kid who'd broken in years back, trying to spook anyone who found it. But the box didn't feel like something planted for a joke. It felt left waiting for me. The air around it had that stillness, that density of intent that crime scenes get just before the body is taken away when the room still remembers. I took the letter out to the attic window for better light. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate, written with a pen that had started to dry out mid-sentence. My name, Harker, was in the same hand but pressed harder, as if whoever wrote it wanted to make sure it couldn't fade. The window pane was cracked through the center, ice forming delicate veins along the glass. Outside, snow fell in slow spirals, swallowing the yard and the edge of the woods beyond. The world below looked suffocated. When I turned back to the box, something else caught my eye, a small shape nestled beneath the papers. A cassette tape, no label, just black plastic, the kind that had gone out of use before the 90s. My pulse ticked in my throat. I hadn't brought any equipment with me, no player, no recorder, but I slipped the tape into my coat pocket anyway. Old habits again, collect first, analyze later. The ladder creaked as I climbed down. The sound seemed too loud in the stillness, echoing through the hall like a voice. Halfway down, I heard a whisper, so faint I thought it was wind forcing its way through the roof beams. It came again, stretched thin and brittle. A single word I couldn't quite make out. Maybe it was my name, or maybe it was nothing at all. When I reached the landing, the hall felt smaller, the air thicker. I told myself to leave, to drive back to town, find a coffee, clear my head before deciding what to do with the letter. But when I reached the top of the stairs, something caught my eye at the end of the hall, just past the master bedroom. A thin line of light was leaking out from beneath the floorboards. It was faint, more suggestion than illumination, but it shouldn't have been there. The power had been cut to the house years ago. I crouched down. The glow was steady, pale, almost blue. When I pressed my ear to the wood, I thought I heard a faint hum, rhythmic, like the low static of an old TV left on in another room. For a long moment, I just watched it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then the hum shifted, a slow modulation, like it was responding to something. And before I realized what I was doing, I was tracing the glow along the boards until I found the seam where the light was strongest. One of the floorboards near the corner had been pried loose and then hammered back poorly. I dug my fingers into the gap and pulled. The nails gave way with a soft, metallic groan. Beneath the board was a small cavity, a crawl space between the floors. The light came from a cracked flashlight still faintly glowing, its battery somehow not yet dead. Beside it lay a stack of photographs, curled from age. I lifted the top one and felt my stomach tight. It was the kitchen, the crime scene exactly as I remembered it. The bodies at the table, the coffee cups, even the frost on the window. But in the corner of the photograph, behind the wife's chair, a shape stood in the shadows. Tall, blurred. Watching, I flipped to the next photo. The same scene, but closer. The figure was gone. The last photo in the stack wasn't from the original investigation. It showed the outside of the house, dated, overexposed, but still clear enough to see a person standing in the upper window. My window, the boy's window. I could see the shape of a head, tilted slightly, like someone watching me from above even now. I put the photos down carefully, one by one, as if any sudden movement might disturb whatever had been captured in them. The flashlight flickered once, dimmed, and went out. The glow vanished, leaving me in the soft gray of daylight leaking through the cracks in the roof. I replaced the board, stood up slowly, and made my way downstairs. The temperature dropped noticeably as I descended. My breath fogged. The kitchen door, which I'd left open, was now half closed. The marks of old fingerprints were visible in the grime on its surface. I stepped through. The room was darker than before. The light from the boarded windows had shifted, throwing long shadows across the floor. The table was still empty, but something about it had changed. The chair, there were 3 when I came in. Now there were 4. I stopped breathing for a second. Every rational explanation ran through my mind, misremembering, visual distortion, the tricks of an old man's nerves. But I remembered the scene vividly, the image seared into my memory from years of case reports and photographs. 3 chairs, one for each of the dead. Now there was a 4th, pulled slightly away from the table, as if waiting for someone else to sit. I moved closer. The legs of the chair scraped slightly when I brushed against it, real, solid, not a trick of the light. I ran my hand over its backrest, cold, damp, like it had been taken from outside. And then faintly, I noticed something carved into the wood, small initials, barely visible beneath the dust. WH. My own. I staggered back a step. The sound of my boots on the old linoleum seemed too loud, echoing off the walls. I'd seen enough symbolic gestures in my career, killers who left mementos, patterns that only made sense to them, but this was different. There was no logic to it. No one had been in that house since it was sealed. No one but me. A sound came from the living room then. Soft, rhythmic, the faint hiss and crackle of static. I turned toward it, pulse drumming in my ears. On the far wall, a television I hadn't noticed before sat half covered by a sheet. Dust drifted from it in thin motes. I was sure there had been no power, no way for anything to run. Yet the screen flickered faintly, gray static pulsing in and out like a heartbeat. I approached slowly, the floor creaking with each step. The image was weak, intermittent. Lines of distortion crawled across the glass. For a moment it was only noise, but then a shape began to form. A figure seated at a table, head bowed. The image shifted, focusing, and I realized it was the Holloway kitchen. The same scene as in the photos, the same table, the same arrangement. Only now there was a fourth figure seated with them. I couldn't look away. The camera, if it was a recording, began to move, panning slowly around the table. The image stuttered, broke into static, and then cleared again just enough for me to see the fourth figure raise its head. The face was obscured by shadow, but I could make out the outline of a coat collar, the glint of something metallic on the chest. A badge. I stepped back. The static grew louder, swallowing the room in white noise. Then the screen went black. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, heavier, more deliberate. I stood there until the cold forced me to move again. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Electrical residue, battery trickle, hallucination. I'd been breathing dust after all. But some smaller, quieter part of me, the part that had been watching over my shoulder since I walked through that door, knew better. The house wasn't showing me memories. It was showing me something I hadn't seen the first time. I left the room, my legs stiff, my breath shallow. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The world looked almost peaceful again, white and clean and deceptively still. But as I stepped onto the porch, I saw something half buried at the base of the steps, a shoe print, small and bare, pointing away from the house toward the tree line. The same as before, I turned back one last time. Through the second-floor window, the boys' window, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker, like a curtain shifting in a draft. But there were no curtains left in that house. The boards over the glass were sealed tight. I drove back to town without looking in the rearview mirror. The tape was still in my coat pocket. The letter, too. I didn't play it that night. I poured myself a drink instead, stared at the empty glass for hours, listening to the faint hum that seemed to follow me even there, like the sound had burned itself into my ears. I told myself I'd go back in daylight, bring someone with me, maybe dig into the old archives, see if any of the evidence logs mentioned photographs that had gone missing. But when I lay down that night, I dreamt of the house again, this time from inside, looking out through that cracked window. Snow falling, a figure in a dark coat walking up the path toward the door. Me, and as the dream faded, I heard that same voice, soft and close, "You missed something." The following days moved like fog, thick, soundless, and slow. I couldn't tell when I stopped sleeping, only that I was awake more often than not. The letter I found in the attic wouldn't leave my mind. It lay on my kitchen table under the weak yellow light, its paper curled at the edges, as though it had been waiting far longer than it should have. The handwriting was unmistakable. My name, written in the same neat block letters that once appeared on the incident reports from the Larkin case. But that was impossible. Everyone connected to it was either dead or long retired, and yet someone had wanted me to see it. For 2 days I didn't open it. I convinced myself I was above superstition, above the kind of curiosity that ruined men. But the silence in that house pressed against me like a held breath. I could feel something beneath it, something watching the stillness, waiting for acknowledgement. So on the third morning I gave in. The envelope was brittle, its flap sealed with a dark wax that cracked like old bone when I pried it open. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice, yellowed but intact. There was no date, no signature. Just 3 lines. I hear them still. They do not rest. You left them here. That was all. No address, no explanation. Just the message, direct, cold, and written in the same steady hand I remembered from the autopsy technician, Claire Hannigan. She'd been one of the few who stayed late the night we processed the scene in '87. The house had been freezing even then, the power long gone, our flashlights cutting through the gloom as the wind pressed at the walls. She'd been quiet all night, her breath fogging as she recorded the details. I hadn't thought of her in decades. Claire had died 3 months after the case closed. Car accident, rain, slick roads, no foul play. I'd read the report myself. So how could her handwriting end up in a sealed envelope tucked beneath floorboards that had likely been untouched for 30 years? I spent that night going through the case file again, the one I kept boxed in my study. The photos had faded slightly, but the images were the same. A family of 4, the Larkins, found in their home midwinter. Husband, wife, 2 children. Official cause, carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace. What the report didn't mention was how arranged it all had seemed. The way their bodies sat together in the parlor, each with hands folded neatly, eyes open as if waiting for instruction. The way the boy's face had turned toward the wall, though there was nothing there to look at. I remembered the furnace clearly. Old cast iron, vented wrong but capable of that kind of leak. Still, something about it never fit. I'd written in my notes that night that the room smelled wrong, not like exhaust or decay, but something metallic, like wet pennies. The autopsy reports had backed the carbon monoxide theory, so I let it go. We all did, but now, holding that letter, it didn't feel closed anymore. The next morning, I returned to the house. Snow had fallen again overnight, burying my tire tracks from before. The air was brittle, the kind that made your lungs sting. The house stood as it had, silent, gray, the kind of silence that eats sound rather than reflects it. The local kids called it cursed. I'd laughed when I heard that years ago. Now I wasn't laughing. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably the moment I crossed the threshold. My breath hung in the air as I walked, flashlight sweeping across the dust. The attic waited above, but I didn't go there first. I started in the basement, where the furnace still sat. It was colder there than outside. I could see my breath plume in front of the beam of my flashlight. The furnace loomed in the corner like a rusted animal, its pipes bent and scarred from years of neglect. I crouched beside it and brushed away the dust. The metal was warm, not hot, warm, as though it had been used recently. That was impossible. The power had been cut for decades. I checked the wires myself. Still, the metal held a faint heat. I pressed my hand against it longer than I should have until I began to hear it, a low, steady hum somewhere beneath the surface, not mechanical. It was rhythmic, irregular, almost like breath. I stepped back. The hum stopped. I stayed there for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes. My watch had stopped, the second hand frozen at 3:47. That was the same time I realized that the medical examiner had logged the family's estimated time of death. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally climbed back upstairs, I could swear the house had changed. The air felt heavier, charged, as though the walls remembered I'd been here before. The staircase creaked under my weight in the same rhythm it had when I first found the bodies. 1, 2, pause, 3. Memory can be cruel that way. At the top of the stairs, I looked toward the attic door. It stood slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way. The draft that spilled down from it was colder than anything else in the house. For a moment I thought I heard it again, that faint sound from before. A whisper, not words exactly, more like the shape of breath forming meaning. I told myself it was wind moving through the boards, but it didn't fade. It followed me low and constant, threading through the stillness like something alive. By the time I stepped back outside, my head was ringing. The whisper had lodged itself somewhere behind my thoughts, like a tune I couldn't forget. The snow had stopped and the sun was low behind the trees. I stood there until the last of the light slipped away, staring at the house. It seemed smaller now, hunched under the weight of its own roof. Yet even from that distance, I could see the faint glow in the upper window, the attic window. Like someone holding a lantern, waiting. That night I didn't dream. Or maybe I did, but I can't tell which part was the dream and which was the memory. I woke to find the letter back on the kitchen table, unfolded, though I'd locked it away in the file box before leaving. The words were the same, but below them, new ink had bled through the page, faint but readable. "Come back, you left something behind." I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of the end. Every case has a point of no return. That was mine. The next morning I woke with the sound of my name in the room. It wasn't loud, not like a shout or even a voice, more like a word breathed too close to the ear. It vanished as soon as I sat up. The house was still. The kind of still that feels deliberate, like silence pretending to be harmless. I told myself I'd imagined it. I'd been spending too much time with the dead again. That's what happens when you open old boxes. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about that letter, about the new line that had appeared overnight. Paper doesn't change itself. Ink doesn't bleed fresh after 30 years. I thought about taking it to the lab, but I already knew what they'd say: contamination, environmental moisture, maybe my own mind trying to connect patterns that weren't there. But I'd seen handwriting shift before, only never in the world of the living. By noon, I was back in the car, the road half buried in snow and silence. The house came into view like a photograph developing from shadow, the shape first, then the details, then the unease that followed it. The chimney leaned slightly now as if the wind had pushed it out of alignment. The mailbox was gone. I didn't remember the front door being open before. The snow inside the entryway was shallow, untouched. No footprints, not mine, not anyone's, just a perfect, undisturbed layer, the kind that suggests a place untouched by time. Upstairs, the attic door waited for me as though it had never closed. I carried a small recorder this time, old habit. I clicked it on and set it near the base of the steps before climbing up. The attic air felt charged, dense with cold. My flashlight beam caught motes of dust drifting through it, slow as ash. The floorboards creaked in long, aching notes. The trunk where I'd found the letter sat open. Empty. I crouched beside it, running my hand along the inside panels. The wood was damp. Not wet, damp, like breath had touched it. When I lifted my hand, the faint outline of fingers appeared beside mine in the dust. Small fingers, child-sized. I froze. The house seemed to know I'd noticed. The temperature dropped again, quick and deliberate, like a held breath turning into a shiver. Somewhere behind me, a soft scraping sound began, the gentle drag of something across wood. I turned, light slicing through the dark. Nothing, just the trunk, the walls, the low beams above. But the scraping didn't stop. It moved, circling the edges of the room, low and careful, as if pacing just out of reach. Then, as quickly as it began, it was gone. I backed toward the stairs, my pulse in my throat. At the bottom, the recorder's light still blinked red. I shut it off and left without looking back. The whisper followed me down the hall, quieter this time, almost like a sigh of disappointment. That night, I listened to the recording. For 23 minutes, there was nothing but the low hum of static and the sound of my own footsteps. Then, just before the end, something else. A faint voice, not mine, not any voice I recognized, just 3 words stretched thin through distortion. "You left us." I replayed it a dozen times, same every time, no trick of audio, no bleed from other frequencies. Just that quiet, steady accusation. I started pulling out my old notebooks after that, case notes, field sketches, reports. I wanted to see if I'd missed anything back then. Something about the phrasing on the recording bothered me. "You left us," not them, us. It was personal. I found my old autopsy summaries next. Claire Hannigan's handwriting, looping and neat, filled the margins of half the pages. Notes about lividity, positioning, the odd detail that the wife's pupils showed no sign of dilation consistent with hypoxia. That had bothered her. She mentioned it to me that night in passing. I'd told her not to overthink it. She'd smiled then, faintly, and said some things didn't fit because we weren't asking the right questions. That was the last conversation we ever had. When she died, they said it was an accident. Rain, oil, a sharp curve. But I remembered seeing her car at the impound lot afterward. The interior had been dry, no rain inside, no broken glass on the driver's side, just a single deep dent on the roof, like something had fallen from above. I shouldn't have gone back to the house a 3rd time, but obsession doesn't argue, it whispers. It tells you that the next visit will make sense of it all, that one more look will settle the ghosts. It never does. The 3rd visit came 2 nights later. Snow had melted into ice that gleamed like water under the moon. The house waited, darker than before, its windows like blank eyes. Inside, the air was motionless. My breath echoed louder than my footsteps. I moved room to room, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in my hand. When I reached the parlor, I saw something new, the imprint of chairs in the dust, arranged the same way they'd been the night of the deaths. 4 faint outlines where wood had once pressed against the floor. Only now there was a 5th, smaller, off to the side. The whisper returned then, steady and closer. This time I didn't mistake it for wind. It rose from beneath the floorboards, a soft cadence of voices, layered and overlapping as though memory itself had found its own sound. I should have left then. I should have turned around, walked out, and never looked back, but I stayed. Because beneath the whisper I thought I heard something else, my own name, spoken the way only guilt can pronounce it. When I finally did leave, the house felt lighter, as if it had given up pretending. The snow had stopped, the trees stood still, but behind me in the attic window the faint light burned again. Only this time I knew it wasn't reflection, it was waiting. And somewhere, deep in the recording still spinning on my desk, I knew those 3 words were no longer just playback, they were invitations. Sleep became a formality. I'd close my eyes and see the attic window, the faint light behind it, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. When I did drift off, the dreams came, fragmented memories that felt too precise to be inventions. I'd hear the snap of my camera shutter, the click of my pen, the wet silence after the furnace stopped. Every sound folded into the next until I couldn't tell what belonged to then and what belonged to now. On the 4th morning after the recording, I drove to the county archive. The building hadn't changed much, beige walls, fluorescent lights, the kind of stale heat that belongs to old bureaucracy. I told myself I was there to confirm facts, not feed superstition. But every fact I found made the superstition look more like a pattern. The coroner's report from 1987 had a supplemental page I didn't remember signing. My initials were there, sharp, deliberate, but the ink tone was different. It authorized the case closure within 24 hours of autopsy. No delay, no cross-tests. I'd never signed off that fast on any multiple fatality case. Next to my initials was another set. Hannigan S. I read it 3 times before realizing the date at the top was wrong. It listed December 17, 1986. The bodies hadn't been discovered until January 87. I pulled the property deed next. The Larkin house had been repossessed by the bank, then transferred to the county. But the transfer log ended abruptly in 1991, blank entries after that. No sale, no foreclosure, just an open line. Like the house had slipped through the cracks of paperwork, I made copies, stuffed them in a folder, and drove home. The sky was low and colorless, snow coming again. The letter was gone when I got back. The box I'd kept it in sat open on the kitchen table, the latch twisted off. Nothing else disturbed. I checked every corner of the house, every drawer, nothing missing. Only the letter. That night, I listened again to the attic recording. At the 30-second mark, just before the whisper began, I caught a faint background noise I hadn't noticed before. A steady tapping, irregular but deliberate. I isolated the audio, amplified it, slowed it down. It wasn't random. It was Morse, 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, SOS. The whisper followed right after, layered over it like a sigh of relief. I spent the next day driving through white fields toward the Larkin property again. The radio cut in and out, static, drowning the stations. Every few miles the transmission would catch on a fragment of voice, news, music, talk, but each time I thought I heard a familiar cadence buried in the noise. Hannigan's voice, or maybe my own. When the house appeared through the trees, I felt that same drop in temperature, like crossing a threshold that doesn't belong to weather. The wind was calm, but the snow near the porch moved in small circular swirls, as if something beneath it breathed. Inside, everything was the same and not the same. The dust seemed to have shifted again, thin trails across the floor that didn't match my footprints. The 5th chair impression in the parlor had deepened, almost tangible now. I crouched to touch the outline. The dust felt warm, the furnace door downstairs was open. I hadn't left it that way. From where I stood, a faint orange glow bled up through the cracks in the floorboards. I could smell metal and old heat. I descended slowly, flashlight shaking. The basement greeted me like a wound reopening. The furnace glowed faintly from within, though the power line still hung severed. The warmth rolled out of it in slow breaths. On the concrete floor beside it lay a photograph. It was one of the scene shots from 1987 taken from the hallway outside the parlor. Only now there was someone standing in the frame who hadn't been there before. A silhouette at the top of the stairs. My silhouette, the shape of my coat, the tilt of my head. I knelt, staring. The edges of the photo were damp, curling inward. As I lifted it, another sound rose, soft, wet tapping from inside the furnace. Like something trying gently, politely to be let out. I stepped closer. The heat was stronger now, pulsing. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low hum that seemed to echo in my ribs. For an instant I saw movement behind the grate, shadows folding in on themselves. Then the hum broke into a faint chorus of whispering voices. Not angry, not pleading, just present. A crowd of breaths shaping one word over and over. Remember. I staggered back, hit the far wall. The hum faded. When I looked again, the glow had gone. The furnace sat dead and cold. I left the house without checking the attic. I couldn't face it yet. Outside, snow had begun to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, each one catching the dull light from the porch. The prints I'd left earlier were already half erased. I drove straight to the precinct, though I hadn't walked through those doors in years. The night clerk didn't recognize me, and I didn't bother with explanations. I went to the evidence room. The Larkin file should have been sealed there, untouched since the early 90s, but the shelf where it belonged was empty. I checked the logbook. No checkout recorded, no destruction order, just a faint pencil mark beside the case number, an infinity symbol drawn small and faint. I knew that symbol. Hannigan used to doodle it on her autopsy notes when she needed to concentrate, said it helped her think about continuity. I wrote the word down on my hand before I realized I was shaking. When I got home, the copied pages from the archive were spread across my table. The edges fluttered in the draft, though the windows were shut. My watch read 3:47 again. Every time I looked away and back, it stayed the same. I tried to write everything down to keep it straight, the letter, the audio, the photograph, but the sentences kept circling back to one thing I'd avoided since the start. The fifth chair, the extra imprint, the sense that I wasn't just investigating the past, I was standing in it. If Hannigan's handwriting could appear decades later, if my initials could predate the discovery, then maybe time wasn't as linear as I'd always assumed. Maybe guilt folds it. Maybe memory replays itself until it finds correction. That night, as the snow thickened outside, I heard the whisper again. Closer this time, not in the walls but in the room. The words clearer now, layered but unified, each voice blending into the next until they sounded almost human. Come back, finish it. The lights flickered once and died. The house exhaled, and somewhere beneath the floor, faint but deliberate, the furnace began to breathe. The mind breaks quietly. Not with screams, but with small permissions. You tell yourself you'll go back one more time, check one more detail, listen to one more recording, and suddenly you're standing in the same place you swore you'd never return to with no clear reason why. That's how it was for me that morning. I didn't plan to go back to the Larkin house. I just found myself on the road again, the tires humming over black ice, the horizon vanishing behind the snow. The letter was still missing, but a new envelope had appeared in its place. It was resting on the passenger seat when I started the engine, as if it had been there all along. I don't remember picking it up. I don't remember seeing it before, but I opened it, of course. The paper inside was blank except for a faint smudge, a fingerprint pressed in what looked like soot. My own. The highway was empty. Snow fell in wide, slow arcs that swallowed the lines on the pavement. I drove in silence, no radio, no thoughts, just the rhythmic blink of the turn signal when I reached the old road that led to the property. When the house came into view, it didn't look abandoned anymore. Smoke, faint gray, rose from the chimney. The attic window glowed with that same steady light. My stomach turned cold. I parked half a mile down, walked the rest of the way. Each step crunched deep into the snow, and the closer I got, the quieter everything became. The kind of quiet that feels like holding your breath underwater. The front door stood open, swinging slightly on its hinges. I stepped inside. Warm air met me, stale but unmistakably warm. The furnace was running again. The whisper wasn't distant anymore. It was everywhere, soft and layered, like 100 voices murmuring in unison just below hearing. I followed the sound to the parlor. The chairs were gone, every trace of dust disturbed. The floor beneath where they'd been was darker, discolored, as though something wet had once pooled there and seeped into the wood. My flashlight caught a faint reflection in that stain. I crouched. Embedded in the grain was the outline of a handprint. The proportions were wrong, the fingers longer than they should have been, the palm too narrow. I touched it and the wood flexed as if soft beneath the surface. My vision swam for a moment. When it cleared, I wasn't alone in the room. I could feel it, that specific kind of presence you never forget from crime scenes. Not a sound, not a breath, just weight. The air heavier behind you than in front. I turned slowly. The mirror above the fireplace, cracked and blackened by time, reflected a figure standing in the doorway. Not a clear image, more like a shadow cut from dim light. The height, the posture, the shape of the shoulders, it was me. But not me now, me then. The man who'd stood here 38 years ago with a badge and a notebook, thinking he understood what he was looking at. The reflection didn't move when I did. I took one step forward, it stayed. Then, as I blinked, it turned its head. The motion was wrong, too fluid, like film skipping a frame. For a heartbeat, the reflection leaned close to the mirror surface, and in that brief distortion, I saw its eyes. They were the same eyes that had stared at me from the Larkins' bodies in those old photographs. I stumbled back. The air around me shifted, the kind of movement that suggests the house itself is breathing in. The whisper swelled. Words began to separate from the murmur. Fragments at first, then a rhythm I could understand. Downstairs, that single word rooted itself behind my ribs. My feet moved before I could think. Down the hall, into the basement again, where the heat rolled from the furnace in slow, uneven pulses. The door hung open wider now. Inside, the light was different, not orange, but pale blue, flickering like the reflection of water. I stepped closer. The sound wasn't humming anymore. It was voices, layered recordings from the past. The dispatch call reporting the deaths, my own voice giving instructions, Claire Hannigan's voice identifying the bodies, every sentence looping over itself, folding backward, the words melting into one another until all that remained was tone, sadness, accusation. I crouched beside the furnace and saw something lodged against the grate, a badge, blackened and warped from heat. My badge, my old number etched across the surface. That was the moment I realized what I'd been avoiding for decades. There had been 5 victims, not 4. The 5th had never been entered into the record because I had written the report, because I'd believed what I needed to believe to keep my hands clean. The sound of breathing filled the basement again. Not mine, not the furnace. Slow, deliberate inhales that vibrated through the walls. Dust lifted off the floor in thin spirals, turning in time with the sound. I could feel the house remembering me, cataloging every footstep, every decision. I took the badge, though it burned my palm. The number glowed faintly against my skin even after I dropped it. When I turned to leave, the stairwell was gone. Just the wall, seamless, smooth, unbroken wood. I reached out, pressing my hand against it, and the whisper returned, not outside, not inside, but through me. It spoke with hundreds of breaths layered together, a single voice made of many. You signed their deaths. I staggered back. The wall shuddered once, then the outline of the stairs returned, faint but real. I climbed fast, every step louder than the last. When I reached the parlor, the mirror was gone and the reflection with it. Only the faint smell of smoke and iron lingered. Inside, the world felt wrong. The snow was falling upward. The trees bent not with the wind but away from the house like they wanted no part of it. I ran until the property line vanished behind me. When I looked back, the light in the attic had changed color. It wasn't gold anymore. It was the same pale blue that burned behind my eyelids when I closed them. That night back home, I pored through my old notes again, searching for anything that mentioned a 5th presence. The evidence log, the photos, the autopsy, nothing. But in one of the field's sketches, a quick drawing of the parlor layout, I'd marked 5XS instead of 4. The fifth had been crossed out hard enough to tear the paper. I flipped the page. There, written faintly along the edge in my own handwriting, was a phrase I didn't remember writing. We buried the wrong family. The whisper in my house started again as I read it, faint at first, then louder, growing into a sound that filled every corner of the room, until I realized it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the badge on my desk, glowing faintly, heat radiating from the metal. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but I remember waking to find the house quiet again. My clock still read 3:47. And for the first time since I'd reopened the case, I didn't feel alone, not in the way that means presence, but in the way that means consequence, because deep down I knew what the whisper wanted now. It wasn't revenge, it was recognition, and I was the only one left alive who could give it. There's a particular silence that follows confession, not peace exactly, but a pause, like the world itself has stopped to listen. That's what filled my house the next morning. The whisper was gone, but the air held the shape of it, as though the sound had only stepped into another room. I sat at the kitchen table, the badge between my palms, the metal cool now, lifeless. Outside, snow covered the fields like unbroken porcelain. Nothing moved, no birds, no tracks, not even the distant hum of highway trucks. It was as if the world had been suspended between breaths. I kept reading the line over and over again in the notebook. We buried the wrong family. The words looked newer than the rest of the page, the pencil darker, sharper, like they'd been written recently. But I hadn't opened this case file in 38 years. There's a certain ache that comes with old memories. They don't just surface, they rise with a smell, a temperature, a rhythm of sound. I could hear it now, the snow crunching under my boots that night, the hollow pop of the furnace door, the voice on the radio saying, "Detective Hannigan, we've got 4. 4, not 5. 4. So where had the 5th come from?" I drove to the county archive that afternoon. The building smelled like mildew and toner, the same way it had back in the 80s. The clerk didn't recognize me, but he recognized the badge number on my ID, said it was retired with distinction. I didn't correct him. He handed me the microfilm reels for 1984, the year of the Larkin murders. I loaded them into the reader, one by one, watching headlines scroll by like ghosts. Family found dead in rural farmhouse. Authorities suspect gas leak. Homicide not ruled out. Then after weeks of coverage, silence. No follow-ups, no trial, no obituaries. I printed the coroner's summary. That's when I saw it, a notation in the corner. Bodies released for burial, next of kin, Hannigan, see Claire Hannigan, my wife, except she hadn't been related to them. She'd been a consulting pathologist on the case. And yet the paperwork said next of kin. My throat went dry. I remembered her face when the case closed, how she'd started sleeping downstairs, claiming she couldn't breathe in our bedroom anymore. How she'd left one night without a note, just her wedding ring and my case file left on the porch. I told myself she couldn't handle the work, but what if she'd known something I did? The whisper returned faintly as I drove home, just a low hum under the engine noise, threading through the static of the radio. It pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. By the time I reached my house, dusk had fallen. The snow reflected what little light remained, and for a moment I could swear I saw footprints leading from the edge of the driveway to the back porch, bare footprints, long and narrow, already filling with frost. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke again. The badge on the table was gone. In its place lay a small, charred bone fragment, human from the size and texture. I didn't need a lab to tell me that. 30 years of homicide work teaches you things you wish you could unlearn. I picked it up, wrapped it in a towel, and drove back to the Larkin property. I don't know why. Maybe because the house was the only place that felt honest now. The snow was deeper, almost to my knees, but the front door stood open again, the same faint blue light pulsing from inside. I entered slowly, the bone in my pocket. The parlor looked untouched, no mirror, no stain, just empty air and dust. But when I stepped toward the staircase, I heard it, a voice, singular this time, come upstairs. Not a whisper, not a hallucination. A voice low and familiar. I climbed, one creaking step at a time. The light from the attic grew brighter until it filled the hallway in long streaks of blue. At the top, the door was closed, sealed with a line of nails that looked hammered from the inside. I pressed my ear to the wood. Nothing. Then faintly, the sound of someone breathing, slow, patient, like waiting. I put my shoulder to the door and pushed. The nails gave way with a sound like cracking ice. Inside was a single room lined with old furniture covered in sheets. A small cot in the corner, a trunk, and in the middle of the floor, 4 small crosses arranged in a circle, burned directly into the wood. A 5th mark had been started but not finished. The air felt electric charged. I took a step forward and the whispering started again, this time in words I could make out. You never left. I turned toward the window. My reflection stared back, except the eyes weren't mine. They were Claire's. Why are you here? I said aloud. Her reflection tilted its head. Because you brought me back. The air rippled. The blue light swelled until the room blurred into silhouettes and shadow. The smell of smoke and earth filled my lungs, and suddenly I wasn't in the attic anymore, I was underground. A faint lantern glowed beside me, showing 5 shapes wrapped in cloth. My breath caught. I reached out to the nearest one. The cloth slid away easily. A face, familiar, half-rotted but unmistakable. My own. The whisper roared now, filling every corner of my skull. You buried us all. I fell backward, choking on the air. The lantern flickered and the light folded in on itself, and I was back in the attic again, gasping, the house silent once more. The crosses on the floor were gone. Only the unfinished mark remained. My pocket was empty, the bone fragment gone. I don't remember leaving. I only remember waking up in my own bed at dawn, the frost thick on the window and the faint outline of a handprint in the condensation. For a long time I just stared at it. Then I wiped it away and saw words traced beneath on the glass itself, as if etched by a fingertip. Find the graves, finish it. I knew where. There was an old field behind the property line. I'd seen it in the original survey notes. Labeled Section B, never excavated. I'd written that report. Claimed it was frozen ground, not worth disturbing. By noon I was there, shovel in hand, wind howling across the field. The snow came down in sheets, turning everything into a blur of white and gray. The first dig yielded nothing but roots and ice. The second, a glint of metal, a button from a uniform. My uniform. The third hole hit something solid. I cleared it with my gloves, wood, splintered, barely a box anymore. Inside, bones, small, not adult, a child's. My stomach turned. I scraped away more snow, and beneath the first coffin was another and another. 5 in total. Only 4 had names burned into the lid. Larkin, 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 Larkin. The 5th was blank. That's when I understood. The 5th wasn't a stranger. The 5th was me, or the version of me that left this field 38 years ago. The man who made peace with silence and let the truth freeze in the ground. The wind rose, whistling through the broken trees. The whisper returned with it, now unmistakably Claire's voice. You remember now. I fell to my knees. The snow around me darkened, not with blood but with shadow, long reaching arms of it curling toward the grave. Finish it, she said again. I didn't know what finishing meant, confession, death, remembrance, only that every lie, every buried name was pushing upward through the snow, demanding to be seen. I stood, shovel in hand, staring at the 5th coffin. The lid shifted on its own, just enough to reveal darkness inside. And for the first time I didn't look away. I didn't remember driving home from that field. The cold must have carried me, or perhaps I never really left. The engine ticked in the driveway long after I cut it off, as though the metal itself refused to cool. Snow gathered over the hood and windows until the car became another pale shape in the yard, another thing being buried. Inside, the air was still. Not silent, but heavy, like a lung waiting to exhale. The smell of smoke lingered faintly, and somewhere within it, that same low murmur pulsed through the walls. It wasn't words anymore, it was rhythm. The sound of breath, heartbeat, the slow turning of something beneath the floorboards. Every photograph in the hallway looked wrong. The light caught faces at angles I didn't remember. The frame that had held Claire's picture hung empty now. Only a faint outline remained where her image had once pressed against the glass. It felt as though the house had been rearranging itself in my absence, quietly undoing what little life I'd left here. I sat down at the table, the same spot where the badge had once been. The badge was back now, polished, gleaming faintly, though I hadn't touched it. Beneath it lay the notebook. The last page had changed. The handwriting wasn't mine anymore, though it tried to be. I could feel the shape of another hand guiding it. The message was simple, 3 words, all of it circling back to the same demand I had seen in Frost and Field. Finish it. It wasn't an instruction. It was a reckoning. I spent hours tracing the old case notes, matching every statement, every name, every photograph. They had never found the source of the fire that gutted the Larkin house. I had written that line myself. The gas leak theory had been mine. But reading it now, I could almost smell the kerosene that had soaked into my gloves that night, the faint trace of it still living somewhere under my nails. The whisper grew louder as the light faded. I didn't need to search for its source anymore. It came from within the walls, the ceiling, the air itself. It followed the rhythm of my heartbeat until I could no longer tell which sound belonged to me. I took the badge and the notebook and left the house just after dusk. Snow had begun to fall again, thicker this time, turning the road into a pale, endless tunnel. The Larkin property sat waiting at the end of it, half swallowed by the storm. The old house leaned under the weight of snow, its windows black and eyeless. Yet from within, a faint glow pulsed, steady as a heartbeat. I stepped inside. The air felt warmer, almost alive. The walls pulsed faintly, the way tree bark seems to move when wind passes through branches. The smell of burning wood clung to everything. It wasn't the smell of a recent fire. It was the residue of one that never stopped. I walked room to room, every creak of the floorboards echoing deeper than sound should. The blue light had returned, pooling near the base of the stairs. The attic door was gone now, in its place a hollow shaft leading upward into blackness. I felt the notebook in my coat pocket. The pages inside shifted, though there was no wind. I opened it. The writing moved. Sentences rewrote themselves, older ink sinking under new. I saw names appear and vanish. Larkin, Hannigan, Claire, all of them looping around a single phrase that grew darker each time it reappeared. We buried the wrong family. I moved toward the stairs. Each step groaned as though something beneath the wood strained to hold my weight. When I reached the landing, the air thinned. I could see my breath again, not as vapor but as shapes, curling upward, forming faint outlines of faces that dissolved as quickly as they formed. At the top, where the attic had been, I found only the open void. The light was gone, yet the whisper continued, now directly beneath my feet. I knelt, pressing my hand to the boards. Warmth pulsed through them, and then a faint vibration. It felt like breathing. I pressed harder. The boards gave slightly, and then one cracked. Beneath it, darkness and the faint smell of soil. I tore at the gap until splinters filled my palms. The hole widened, revealing a shallow pit. Inside lay the remains of another uniform, mine, folded neatly over a shape I couldn't bring myself to uncover. I knew what it would be. The 5th, the one without a name, the one I had buried in every silence and half-truth since that winter. My pulse slowed. My body felt weightless, as if I were being unstitched from time. The whisper quieted until there was only one voice left, faint and measured, speaking not to me but through me. It wasn't anger or accusation. It was completion. The house exhaled. Dust fell from the rafters in soft waves. The air turned warm for the first time in decades. I stayed there until the storm passed, watching the snow melt slowly through the broken window, water running down the walls like tears. When dawn came, the house no longer looked haunted. It looked empty, ordinary, like any other abandoned place left to rot quietly into the ground. I buried the notebook in the field that morning, beside the 5th grave. The shovel hit something solid, not wood this time, but stone. A headstone, half buried, carved with a single word. Hannigan. The frost bit into my hands, but I didn't stop. I cleared the name until the letters shone clean. My own. The wind moved through the trees, soft and final. No whisper followed, only silence. I left the shovel standing there, the badge resting on top of the disturbed snow. As I turned toward the road, the horizon burned faintly with sunrise, pale and indifferent. Behind me, the house seemed smaller, receding into the distance until it was no longer a place at all, only a memory collapsing into itself. And in that quiet, for the first time in years, I felt something like stillness. Not peace, never peace, but something close enough to let me breathe. The snow didn't stop for 3 days after that morning. I watched it from the small motel room I'd taken near the county line, the kind of place with humming lights and wallpaper that curls at the corners. The world beyond the window turned white, and I could almost imagine that field disappearing beneath it again, taking the graves, the house, and everything else I'd stirred up back into silence. But the quiet wasn't real. It never is. It sat just behind the walls, steady and patient, the way rot waits beneath paint. Sleep came in fragments. Each time I closed my eyes, I found myself standing in the same field, though it was no longer winter. The air was warm, the grass too green, the horizon bending in ways it shouldn't. The house stood where it always had, though now its windows reflected nothing. When I woke, my hands were cold and damp, like I'd been holding snow. I told myself this was the body's way of remembering, not the mind's. A reaction, not a haunting. I'd worked too many cases not to recognize the tricks of exhaustion and trauma. Still, when I looked at my hands, I sometimes saw soil beneath my nails. On the fourth morning, I drove back into town. The streets were deserted, snowbanks piled high against doorways. The diner where I used to eat during long stakeouts was gone, boarded up and forgotten. Even the precinct had changed, new paint, new sign, but the same cracks in the steps I used to climb. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and paper. I asked for the records clerk, but the young officer behind the desk told me there hadn't been one by that name for years. He said it kindly, the way people talk to the elderly when they think they might be confused. I walked out without explaining who I was. There was no point. The people who could have remembered me were gone or buried under their own winters. I drove aimlessly after that, following roads that used to mean something. Past the old mill, the frozen creek, the cemetery where I'd once buried a partner who didn't deserve it. Everything looked smaller, as though the years had eaten away not just the people, but the shape of the land itself. By dusk, I found myself back near the edge of the forest that bordered the Larkin property. The snow there was untouched. The field beyond it was a flat expanse of white. Yet from a distance I could see a faint depression in the snow, the shape of a roofline, the shadow of something that wasn't there. I parked and walked the rest of the way. The air was colder here, sharper, as if the storm had never truly passed. My footprints were the first to mark the field, but halfway across I noticed another set joining mine. Smaller, lighter, leading ahead, bare feet again, pressing into the surface without sinking. I followed them. They led me to the place where I had buried the notebook. The shovel was gone. In its place was a mound of freshly turned snow. I knelt and brushed it aside. Beneath it lay a new headstone. Not the old weathered slab I'd unearthed before. This one was clean, the carving crisp and recent. It bore no name, only the word detective. I don't know how long I stayed there staring at it. The wind rose around me, not with words but with a sound I hadn't heard in decades. The soft, rhythmic creak of floorboards, the echo of footsteps moving above my head. I turned. The field had changed. The horizon was gone, replaced by the faint outline of walls. The ground beneath my feet darkened, turning from snow to wood, each board familiar, each flaw in its grain remembered by touch. The air warmed, carrying the smell of smoke and oil. The house had returned. Or perhaps it had never left. I stood in what had once been the parlor. The mirror was there again, whole, uncracked, reflecting a faint shimmer of blue light from the hallway beyond. I saw movement in it, the suggestion of another figure behind me, blurred by distance. I didn't turn. It felt wrong to move, wrong to breathe. Time had folded in on itself. The house was no longer a place, but a state of being, one I'd never truly escaped. The light shifted again, and for a moment I saw the attic door restored, the staircase ascending into the same soft glow that had marked every return. The house wanted me to climb. It always had. Each step groaned underfoot, though I felt no weight. My hands trailed along the banister, the wood smooth and cold. The whisper came back then, faint but steady, no longer pleading or angry. It simply recited the rhythm of my own breath. At the top of the stairs, the attic door hung open. The air inside shimmered like heat above asphalt. The crosses were gone, the trunk was gone. Only the faint outline of 5 shapes marked the floor, like the impression of bodies long removed. I moved to the center of the room and stopped. The light faded. The walls receded into shadow until the world narrowed to a single circle of floorboards beneath me. I could feel something shift under them, a heartbeat, a pulse, maybe my own. The whisper faded. The silence deepened until I could hear nothing at all, not even the wind, not even myself, and then the sound returned, not from the room but from somewhere deeper. A soft, steady ticking, not a clock but something older, the rhythm of time itself resetting. I realized then what the house had been trying to show me all along. It was never about guilt, never about punishment. It was about repetition. Every act, every lie, every buried truth becomes the ground on which the next story stands. We build our houses from it. We live in them. We whisper through their walls. The snow outside began to fall again. I could see it through the cracks in the roof, swirling downward like ash. It landed softly on the floorboards, melting where it touched, the faint warmth still radiating from below. I stayed until I could no longer tell where I ended and the house began. When I finally stepped outside, dawn had broken again, though I had no sense of how much time had passed. The field lay silent, no footprints behind me, no sign the house had ever been there, only the wind, steady and cold, carrying the faintest trace of breath that almost sounded like my own name. I did not sleep after that night. The house had taken on a pulse of its own, slow and rhythmic, like it was breathing through the vents. Every sound in the dark reminded me that I was no longer alone in that place if I ever had been. The snow outside had thickened, muting the world, trapping me in a cocoon of silence that pressed close against the windows. I kept the fire burning in the stove, but even with the heat, my skin prickled as if something unseen were moving just behind me. I went through the case files again, more methodically this time, every photograph and report spread across the dining table. I had read them so many times they should have lost meaning, but now I saw patterns where before there had been only evidence. Dates that overlapped with newspaper clippings from years I didn't remember investigating. Witness names that didn't match my reports. Even my own handwriting, familiar yet off somehow, like someone had mimicked it after too many years apart. The official record said the Mitchell family died on January 14, 1982. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace. But tucked behind one of the reports was another coroner's statement. Same name, same date, but the cause of death read undetermined trauma. My signature was at the bottom, scrawled in pen that had faded to gray. I didn't remember signing it. I didn't remember writing it at all. By morning, I was convinced I had been part of something I'd never understood. Maybe I'd buried it so deep I'd rewritten the story in my mind. That's what trauma does. It edits the truth into something survivable. But the house wouldn't let me keep my illusions. The whispers began again, clearer this time, steady and overlapping, too many voices at once. They came from the walls, not loud enough to be words but rhythmic, like breathless recitations of names or prayers. I pressed my ear against the wood paneling and could almost make out a pattern. Short bursts, a pause, then another. Morse code, I thought. But when I tried to transcribe it, the rhythm shifted, like it was aware of what I was doing. Later that day, I followed the sound to the narrow hallway near the back door, the one that always stayed cold no matter how much I turned up the heat. The paint was blistered there, warped from some past fire. I touched the wall and felt vibration beneath it, subtle, like a small motor running somewhere inside. I pried up the baseboard, then the drywall, until I exposed a hollow cavity filled with ash and the brittle remains of burnt photographs. Most of the pictures had fused together, blackened beyond recognition. But one near the center survived. It showed a young girl standing on the front porch, her hair tangled by wind, her expression blank and almost lifeless. Behind her, in the shadowed doorway, was a figure that didn't belong. It was faint, blurred, but unmistakably there. A man standing half in, half out of the frame, his face obscured as though the light refused to touch it. I stared at it for hours. When I finally looked away, I realized I had been hearing my own name in the whispering. Not spoken clearly, not aloud, but inside the layers of sound, drawn out, repeating until it dissolved into a hiss. I dropped the photo, and for a long time I couldn't tell if the trembling in my hands was from fear or from something deeper, something like recognition. By evening, the whispers had changed. They no longer came from the walls. They came from inside the radio, from the pipes, from the wind pressing against the eaves. I tried to drown them out with noise, turning on the old television, running the faucet, stoking the fire until sparks leapt into the room. Nothing helped. Then the power went out. The house fell into blackness, the kind that erases all sense of space. I lit a candle and moved carefully through the rooms. In the flickering light, the shadows bent in ways that didn't make sense. Corners deepened, hallways seemed longer. I saw faint outlines in the glass of the window, faces behind me where there should have been none. I kept hearing footsteps, slow and deliberate, always one room away. I told myself it was the old floorboards shifting in the cold. I told myself a lot of things that night to keep from admitting what I knew. When I finally sat down, exhausted and shaking, I noticed the notebook I'd left open earlier had new writing in it. The ink was still wet. The handwriting wasn't mine, though it looked close enough to fool me at first glance. The words were uneven, frantic, like someone had written them in the dark. "You remember now, don't you?" That's all it said. The candle flickered out then, and in the silence that followed, I could hear breathing behind me, slow, measured, patient. I didn't turn around. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening to something I couldn't see but knew was real. When morning came, the light through the frost-covered windows looked gray and sickly, like the world outside had lost all color. The note in the notebook was gone, the page blank again. But I could still smell the ink, sharp and metallic, clinging to the air. I spent the rest of the day packing my things, telling myself I'd leave before nightfall. But as dusk fell, the snow came again, thick and relentless, and the road vanished beneath it. The house creaked and settled, the whispers distant now, almost tender, as if it knew I wasn't going anywhere. That night I dreamed of the girl in the photograph. She was standing at the top of the stairs, her mouth moving, her eyes hollow and fixed on me. I couldn't hear her words, but I understood them all the same. "The past doesn't sleep," she said without sound. "It only waits for someone to wake it." When I woke, the candle beside me was lit again, though I hadn't touched it. And from the hallway came that soft, persistent sound, the one I'd been pretending not to recognize, the slow, steady rhythm of someone whispering my name. The next morning brought a stillness I could not trust. The storm had passed, leaving a blinding white glare across the frozen fields, but the air inside the house remained stale, as though it had not been touched by daylight. I made coffee just to hear the sound of something familiar, but even that small act felt wrong. The kettle hissed, the mug trembled slightly in my hand, and the liquid inside swirled without my movement. I watched the steam rise and realized that it wasn't drifting upward. It was curling toward the back hallway, toward the cold part of the house. I told myself I would only stay long enough to document everything properly. I would photograph the evidence, record the sounds, preserve it for whoever came after me. But that was a lie I couldn't sustain for long. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I already knew I wasn't leaving. Not yet, maybe not ever. The whispers had grown quieter since the storm, but not gone. They pulsed beneath the noise of the house, low and rhythmic, as though the place had developed a heartbeat. Every few minutes I could feel it. An almost imperceptible tremor through the floorboards, a thud too deep to be plumbing or wind. It synced with my pulse until I could no longer tell which was mine. I spent hours reviewing the old investigation notes. Something about them gnawed at me now, the inconsistencies multiplying each time I read them. In one report, the victims were 3. In another, 4. A later summary referred to a witness, though no such person appeared in the final case file. It wasn't sloppy work, it was deliberate, as if someone had rewritten the story in pieces and left me to find the seams. At some point, I realized my own name was missing from several pages where it should have been. The signature at the bottom of the autopsy request belonged to someone else entirely, someone with the same initials but a different hand. It was clean, practiced, professional. Mine had never looked like that, not even when I was young. I checked the house records again. The Mitchell property had been sold twice after the deaths, but both transactions were incomplete. The deeds listed only one buyer's name, though it was blacked out on the copy I'd received. Yet beneath the ink, faintly visible under a certain light, I could see the start of a signature, the first letter of my last name. That discovery should have sent me packing. Instead, I stayed, because now the thought had rooted deep in my mind. Maybe I hadn't just investigated this case. Maybe I had lived it. That night, the whispering changed again. It wasn't scattered anymore. It came in patterns, pauses that mimicked breathing. I followed the sound into the narrow corridor near the cellar door. The air grew heavy as I descended the steps, the wooden railing cold beneath my hand. The cellar had always been the darkest part of the house, but this time it felt wrong in a way I couldn't name, like stepping into a memory that didn't belong to me. The flashlight beam caught movement in the far corner. At first I thought it was dust, disturbed by my breath, but then the dust began to drift against the air current, curling in shapes that resembled hands or faces just for an instant before fading. I aimed the light higher and saw faint impressions on the stone wall, scratches not random but arranged in rows. Marks of counting, 1, 2, 3, then a long space and 4 more, 7 total. I ran my hand over them. The stone felt warm to the touch, as if heat still radiated from beneath. Then I noticed the faint smell, sweet, decayed, unmistakable. The same odor that clung to every death scene I'd ever worked. Something moved above me then, a creak in the floorboards, slow and deliberate. I turned off the light instinctively and waited. The darkness pressed in tight, the air damp and still. I listened, another step, then another. They came to rest directly above my head. For a long time there was silence. Then I heard breathing, ragged, uneven, not mine. When I finally climbed the stairs, the air felt heavier, as though the house were watching my ascent. The candle I'd left on the table had burned down to its base, wax pooling across the wood like blood. Next to it sat the photograph I'd found in the wall cavity, only now the image had changed. The girl was gone. In her place stood the blurred man, his shape clearer, closer to the lens. The background behind him was no longer the porch. It was the kitchen, my kitchen. I tore the photo in half, but when I looked down again, there were 2 identical copies on the table. The tears were mirrored, perfect reflections of each other. I stayed awake until dawn. The wind returned, clawing at the eaves, carrying faint sounds I didn't want to recognize. Whispers stretched thin across distance, fragments of voices calling from somewhere between the walls. I tried to record them, but when I played the tape back, there was nothing but static. Beneath that static, though, was rhythm. A voice buried too deep to isolate, murmuring the same words over and over. It's time to remember. The next day, I took my car out as far as the road would let me before snow and ice made it impossible to continue. I wanted to leave the house behind me even for an hour, just to see something that wasn't gray and frozen. But halfway down the road, I realized the landmarks were wrong. The fence line on the left had shifted, the trees leaned in different directions. I checked the map, then the compass. Both disagreed with the world around me. When I turned back, the road stretched longer than it should have. The house sat on the horizon, no closer no matter how long I drove. I killed the engine and sat in the silence. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield, melting into faint rivulets that looked like veins. In that moment, I understood something terrible. The house wasn't keeping me there. I was keeping myself. Because somewhere inside that rotting frame was a truth I had buried decades ago, and it was calling me back, whispering in my own voice. When I finally returned to the porch, the door was already open, snow blowing inside. The warmth of the fire had returned on its own. The house welcomed me like it had been waiting, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt no fear. Only a slow, heavy certainty that whatever had begun here in 1982 had never ended, not for the family, not for me. Not for the house. It had only been waiting for the sound of my footsteps to begin again. I woke to the sound of dripping water, though there was no rain. The roof above my bed was intact, yet the rhythmic tapping continued somewhere close, steady, deliberate, like the ticking of a slow clock. The air smelled of rust and damp wood, and when I opened my eyes, I realized I was lying on the floor of the living room instead of the bed upstairs. My clothes were damp, my hands stained with dirt I couldn't account for. The light through the window was pale and colorless. the kind that makes it impossible to tell what time it is. Morning, perhaps, or maybe the last hour of night refusing to let go. I stood and looked around. The fire had burned out, leaving the air heavy with the scent of ash. The photograph that had multiplied the night before was gone from the table. In its place lay a thin layer of dust, though I had wiped the surface clean only yesterday. I followed the dripping sound to the hallway. The floorboards there bowed slightly, as if something beneath them shifted with my weight. The noise grew louder, not like water now, but like something viscous sliding down the walls. I crouched low and saw the faint sheen of liquid seeping from the seam where the wall met the floor. It wasn't water, it was darker, thicker. The color of old blood diluted by time. I should have been afraid. I was. There's a point in every investigation where fear turns into curiosity, where the need to know outweighs everything else. That's the point where most men break. I had crossed that line years ago. I peeled back a section of the paneling. Behind it the wood was soaked through, warped and soft, but what caught my attention was the faint shape pressed into the insulation, a handprint small, almost childlike. It wasn't painted or burned. It had been left by pressure alone, as if someone had reached out from the other side of the wall. Something inside me shifted then, a memory dislodged. A cold night, a little girl's voice. A furnace that wouldn't stay lit. The case file said carbon monoxide, but I remembered standing outside that house 30 years ago, watching the coroner carry out the bodies. Snow had fallen just like this, but there had been only 2 stretchers, not 3. So who was the third victim listed in my report? I went to the cellar again, though I swore I wouldn't. The air grew heavier with each step down, thick enough to taste. I brought no light this time, only the dull glow from above. The marks on the wall were clearer now, deepened, as if freshly carved, but the number had changed, 8 instead of 7. I traced the newest mark with my finger and felt warmth beneath the stone. It pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. Something shifted behind me. A soft scrape, fabric brushing stone. I turned, but there was nothing there, only the staircase leading back up, the faint outline of light at the top. I should have gone then, but a shape caught my eye near the far wall, low to the ground. A wooden crate, half buried in dust and cobwebs. It wasn't there before. I opened it carefully. Inside were objects that shouldn't have survived decades. A cracked porcelain doll, a lock of blonde hair tied with red ribbon, and an evidence tag marked with my initials. Beneath it all, folded neatly, was a child's dress, blue with faded white stitching. I recognized it instantly, though I had never seen it before. The girl in the photograph had been wearing that dress. The whispers started again, but they weren't coming from the walls now. They came from within the crate. The sound was faint, like breathing through water, but it formed words I could almost make out. I leaned closer and caught fragments, a plea, a confession, maybe both, then silence. When I looked back at the wall, the 8th mark was gone. In its place was a smear of fresh soot shaped like a palm. The fingers pointed upward toward the ceiling. I left the crate where it was and climbed the stairs. My legs felt unsteady, as though I'd been walking in circles for hours. When I reached the living room, the light through the windows had shifted to a dull orange, the color of a sunset that didn't belong to any hour of the day. The air hummed faintly, vibrating through the floorboards. On the table lay the photograph again, this time only half developed, the edges curling as though it had been pulled from a chemical bath too soon. The image showed the kitchen, the same angle as before, but now there were shapes, 3 this time, standing in the doorway, 2 adults and a child. The man's face was still obscured. The woman's head was tilted unnaturally, as though her neck couldn't hold its weight. And the child, the little girl, had her hands over her eyes. Behind them at the edge of the frame was me, not as I am now, but as I was 30 years ago. Younger, uniformed, a hand on the man's shoulder. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of exposure. A double image, some manipulation of old film, but the feeling in my chest told me otherwise. The house wasn't showing me ghosts, it was showing me memory. As I stared at that photo, I began to remember things I had buried too deep to retrieve until now. The night of the fire, the smell of gas, the woman's screams, the way the snow fell in silence after it was done. I remembered standing in the front yard, the house glowing behind me, my breath visible in the freezing air. Someone had asked me what happened, and I had said the words I would repeat for years. Accident, faulty furnace, nothing could be done, but that wasn't true. I knew it then, and I know it now. It wasn't an accident, and the man in the photograph, the one I had always assumed was the father, it wasn't him standing beside the girl. It was me. The realization came slow, inevitable. The weight of it pressed into me like the cold. All this time I had come here to uncover a story I thought I had forgot. But maybe I hadn't forgot. Maybe I had been called back to finish it. The house had never been haunted by the dead. It had been haunted by me. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying a low moan through the eaves. The sound swelled until it filled every room, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I felt it move through me, shaking loose what little resolve I had left. The candle on the table went out without warning. The last thing I saw before darkness returned was my reflection in the window. For a moment, it wasn't my face staring back. It was his, the younger version of me, smiling faintly, eyes hollow and calm. Then he stepped forward and the glass went black. There are certain moments when the past stops feeling like memory and starts feeling like gravity. Something that pulls at you, draws you downward, until the weight of it becomes too much to resist. That was what it felt like waking the next morning, or maybe it wasn't morning at all. The light through the windows was the same dim gray it had been for days, neither dawn nor dusk, as though time had given up moving. The house smelled of burned wood and wet earth. My watch had stopped sometime in the night. I tried to steady myself with routine: boil water, write notes, photograph the evidence, but the camera wouldn't focus. Every image came out blurred, as though the air itself refused to be captured. When I looked through the viewfinder, the rooms seemed wider, emptier, the corners deeper. And in the photographs, always there was a faint outline behind me, something that didn't exist when I turned around. The whispers had quieted to a hum, a low vibration beneath the floors. I could feel it through my shoes, pulsing, rhythmic. It wasn't random. It had a pattern: long, short, short, long, almost a heartbeat. Or perhaps a knock. I began to suspect that what I heard weren't voices at all, but echoes. Sounds trapped in the walls, replaying moments long dead. But that didn't explain why they changed when I moved through the house, why they sometimes followed me, or why, when I stopped to listen, I could hear them breathing in time with my own. At noon, or what I thought was noon, I decided to confront whatever waited in the cellar. I armed myself with the camera, a flashlight, and a small revolver I hadn't fired in years. It was absurd, I knew. Bullets don't help against ghosts or memories. But it gave my shaking hands something to hold. The descent felt longer this time, as if the stairs multiplied in the dark. The air grew warmer the farther I went down. My breath fogged in front of me, not from cold, but from something else. The faint metallic scent that clings to old blood. When I reached the floor, I saw that the markings on the wall had spread. Not carved now, but seared into the stone, black and glistening as if still burning. The symbols no longer looked like tally marks. They were forming letters, rough and uneven, as if written by a shaking hand. I leaned closer and realized what they spelled: my name. Each letter pulsed faintly in the dark, the way embers breathe before they die. Something shifted behind me then. A faint shuffle, followed by the sound of fabric dragging across concrete. I turned the flashlight and caught a glimpse of motion near the back wall, a shadow peeling itself from the darkness. For an instant I thought it was my reflection, distorted by the beam. But then it moved when I didn't. The shape stood at the edge of the light. I couldn't make out its features, only its stance, familiar, too familiar. One shoulder slightly higher, the same old injury I'd carried since the job. I called out before remembering that no one was listening. The sound of my voice felt wrong in the air, too loud, too alive. The shape tilted its head as though studying me. Then it took a step forward. The flashlight flickered, and for a fraction of a second I saw it clearly. My own face, younger, whole, unscarred by time. Then the light went out. In the darkness I could hear the house breathing again. Long, slow, deliberate. The sound of something ancient exhaling beneath the floor. I tried to move, but my legs felt rooted. I could feel the presence standing just behind me now, close enough that the air on my neck grew cold. When I turned, there was nothing. Only the wall, the fresh marks glowing faintly, shifting. The letters rearranged themselves before my eyes, forming a new word, confess. I stumbled backward, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark as it came back to life. The cellar looked smaller now, as though the walls had closed in. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, the air pressing harder with every step. When I reached the top, the door slammed behind me with enough force to rattle the frame. The whispering began again, louder, insistent. It came from every direction, the walls, the ceiling, the pipes. It was no longer many voices, but one, split into fragments, rising and falling in rhythm. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I knew what it wanted. The truth, the weight of memory, broke open then all at once. The smell of smoke, the sound of glass shattering, the screams that didn't stop until the fire had eaten the air. The man standing in the doorway pleading, the child hiding behind the stair, the cold fury in my chest when I raised the gun. The silence after I had told myself for decades that I'd found that family dead when I arrived, that I'd done everything I could, but I remembered now. The argument, the flash of the pistol. The way the house caught fire after I'd left, like it wanted to erase what I'd done. It hadn't been an investigation. It had been a cover-up, my cover-up. I sank to the floor, shaking. The air around me pulsed with the sound of 100 heartbeats, all in perfect unison. The lights flickered, casting shadows that twisted and stretched along the walls. I could feel them moving toward me, gathering, waiting. The photograph on the table had changed again. The figures were clearer now. 3 bodies at the foot of the stairs, smoke curling around them. And standing in the doorway was the man with the gun. Me, the image seemed to breathe, the smoke curling outward, filling the room. I watched as my younger self in the photograph turned his head toward me, eyes bright and empty. His mouth opened, though no sound came. Then I heard it, faint and far away, a voice inside the hum. You can't leave until you finish what you started. I closed my eyes. The whispering stopped. The house went still. But somewhere deep beneath the floor I could hear it again. The faint ticking sound, steady and patient, like water dripping in an endless well. Or perhaps a clock counting down to something I no longer had the strength to stop. The past wasn't haunting me anymore. I was haunting it, and the house knew it. By the time the light returned, I knew the house had changed again. The walls had shifted subtly, the doors hung at new angles, and the air had grown heavier, charged, as though waiting for something. It was no longer simply an old place holding its memories. It had become a living thing, and I was somewhere inside its lungs. I hadn't slept, though I couldn't remember trying. The line between waking and dreaming had thinned until they felt the same. Every time I blinked, I saw flashes of the night I'd tried to forget. The fire, the gun, the look in the man's eyes before the smoke took him. I could no longer tell if these were recollections or the house replaying what I'd done, frame by frame, like it wanted me to sit through my own confession. The morning light came through, gray, diffused by frost, and caught the kitchen in a flat wash of color. My coffee mug sat where I'd left it the night before, half full, ice crusted along the rim. The liquid inside rippled faintly, disturbed by something unseen. The hum in the walls had grown louder. I could feel it in my teeth. The photograph lay on the table again. It had changed once more. Now it showed the house from a distance, engulfed in flame, the snow around it turning black. At the edge of the photo stood a figure watching from the tree line, small, motionless. The same child I'd seen in every image before, her face clearer now, eyes too dark to reflect the light. I turned it over and found something scrawled on the back in my handwriting. You left her there. The words looked fresh, the ink still damp. I didn't remember writing them, but the shape of the letters was mine. Same slope, same hesitation before every R. For hours I sat in silence, the house creaking around me until the whispering began again. It came low and steady, threading through the boards beneath my feet, the sound of something stirring awake. I followed it without thought, moving through the narrow hall that led to the back stairwell. The steps there had always felt steeper, older, carved by hands that didn't belong to this century. Halfway up I stopped. The air shimmered faintly as if heat rose through the cold. The whispering grew clearer, now layered with another sound, soft crying, the kind that comes from exhaustion, not fear. It was coming from the room at the end of the hall, the same room I'd avoided since the day I arrived. The door was slightly open. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through lace curtains stained yellow with age. The air smelled of soot and something sweet, like old flowers left too long in water. Against the far wall stood a small bed, its sheets untouched by dust. A child's room. I stepped closer. The crying stopped. On the bed lay a shape beneath the blanket, small and motionless. I reached out, hand trembling, and pulled it back. There was no body, only a collection of old objects: an empty shoe, a cracked teacup, a handful of blackened matchsticks, arranged carefully, almost reverently, like a ritual. Beneath them was a page torn from a notebook. My notebook, it read. I tried to save her. The air in the room shifted then, a pressure change so sudden it made my ears ring. The curtains lifted though the windows were closed. The smell of smoke thickened, and for an instant I could hear it again, the fire, distant but rising. The past had begun to move. I turned toward the door, but it wasn't there anymore. The walls had drawn closer, the corners stretched long. The wallpaper peeled itself back, revealing scorched beams beneath. I heard the faint pop of glass cracking, the groan of wood surrendering to flame. The temperature climbed fast, unbearable, though there was no fire in sight. When I looked down, the floor had changed. The rug was gone, replaced by old linoleum patterned in a style I hadn't seen since the 80s. The furniture was newer now, the air alive with heat and the sharp scent of burning gas. I was no longer in the present. The house had folded time back on itself and dragged me through. Outside, snow still fell, but through the window it glowed orange from the reflection of flames. I could hear shouting, my own voice among them, younger, urgent, terrified. The same words I'd heard replaying in dreams for years. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." The front door burst open downstairs. A man's shadow crossed the threshold, and I knew it was him, the father, the one whose name I'd buried beneath my reports. His footsteps thundered up the stair. I could hear the gun in my hand before I saw it. The weight was familiar, comforting, inevitable, but I wasn't holding it now. I was watching myself hold it. The house wasn't just showing me memory anymore. It was rebuilding it, brick by brick, scream by scream. The younger version of me raised the gun, shouting something I couldn't hear. The man lunged forward and the shot rang out, sharp and final. The echo bounced through the burning walls, looping endlessly. The woman's scream followed, then silence, except for the roar of the fire catching on the curtains. The younger me turned toward the child's room. For a heartbeat our eyes met through the veil of smoke. He didn't see me. He saw her, the little girl I had forgotten, the one I'd sworn I'd saved, but I hadn't. He ran toward her, voice into the flame, and then the world went white. When the light dimmed, I was back in the house as it is now, cold, empty, half-rotted. The floor beneath me blackened, burned decades ago. My throat tasted of ash. The whispering had stopped. The silence felt heavier than any noise could. I walked to the window. Outside, the snow fell steady, peaceful. The world looked untouched, innocent, as though none of it had ever happened. But when I looked closer, I saw small footprints leading from the porch steps into the woods. Fresh ones, bare feet in the snow. The footprints stopped halfway to the tree line. The last one turned toward the house. The child's voice came again, faint and close this time, from the top of the stairs. A whisper not carried by air but memory itself. "You left me here." The house exhaled and every light went out at once. I didn't move for a long time after the lights went out. The house was silent again, but it wasn't an empty silence. It felt occupied, listening. The darkness pressed close and I could feel my own pulse echoing against the floorboards. Eventually, I found my flashlight. The beam was weak, its battery near dead, but it carved a narrow path through the black. I followed it toward the front door. The air had grown colder, sharp with frost and the faint metallic tang of snow. My breath came in thin clouds. Outside, the night had thickened. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness so deep it bordered on unnatural. The moon hung low, blurred by haze, and the world was washed in silver and gray. The footprints I'd seen from the window were still there, small, distinct, winding through the yard toward the tree line. I stepped down from the porch. The snow crunched beneath my boots, breaking the silence like glass. Each step I took seemed to erase the world behind me, as though I were walking deeper into something that didn't want to be remembered. The prints led straight into the woods, and I followed them, beam shaking, heart unsteady. They weren't just the marks of a passing animal or illusion of drifted snow. They were clear, Human, a child's feet, bare, each one pressed deep enough to show the curve of toes. Halfway to the trees, I felt it again, the faint hum. The same low vibration that had haunted the house, now pulsing through the ground itself. I paused, listening. Somewhere in the dark, wood creaked, not the snapping of branches, but the unmistakable sound of floorboards. It was impossible. There was no floor here, only snow and frozen soil. The footprints continued to the edge of the woods, then stopped abruptly. I scanned the trees, the snow-laden branches swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. My beam caught a faint shape among the trunks, a sliver of white fabric disappearing behind a tree. I stepped closer, my breath quickening. The air changed. The smell of pine gave way to something older, sour and wet, like soil turned over after decades. The beam trembled in my hand, and I realized my fingers were numb, not from cold, but from something that felt like pressure, like the woods themselves were pushing back. The tree line opened into a small clearing I'd never seen before. In the center stood a foundation, what was left of one. The stones were old, the kind used in farmhouses a century ago, half buried under moss and snow. It looked like something had once stood here, long before the house I'd been staying in, and there in the middle of the ruin was a door. It stood upright, freestanding, its frame perfectly intact, though there were no walls around it. A relic from another place and time. I recognized it immediately. It was the same door from the child's room, the one that had vanished and reappeared in different parts of the house. The air around it shimmered faintly, a distortion like heat. The hum grew stronger, rising through my bones. I took a step closer. My flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed the clearing, but not completely. The door glowed faintly, light leaking through its cracks like something alive behind it. And then beneath the hum came a sound so quiet I almost missed it, the faint rhythm of breathing. Slow, steady, in perfect sync with my own. For a moment I thought I was having another of those waking dreams, but when I reached out, my hand met the door's surface. It was warm, almost pulsing. I pushed it open. There was no threshold, no room beyond, just more snow, and yet it wasn't the same snow I'd walked through. It looked older, untouched, covering a house that no longer stood. My light, though gone, was replaced by a soft orange glow flickering on the horizon. Firelight. I stepped through. The world shifted like water around me. I was standing in the same clearing, but it was no longer night. The storm hadn't yet come. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid. Flames licked at the skeleton of a wooden house, the house as it had been on the night it burned. I could hear shouting from inside, a man's voice, then a child's cry, the same cry I'd heard echoing through the present-day walls. I tried to move closer, but the air itself resisted, heavy with heat and memory. Through the smoke, I saw myself again, young, panicked, running toward the door with a gun in one hand and guilt already written across my face. I shouted for him, for me, but my voice made no sound. The past didn't hear the present. It only replayed what it wanted to. The younger me disappeared into the blaze. I followed, powerless to stop it, drawn like metal to a magnet. The door frame flared white as I passed through. Inside was chaos. Fire ate the walls. The wallpaper peeled like skin. A woman lay motionless near the stairs, her face hidden beneath soot and ash. And somewhere above, the child was still crying. The heat should have been unbearable, but I felt only cold. Each step echoed hollow, as though I were walking inside my own mind. When I reached the second floor, I saw her. She stood at the end of the hall, the same girl from the photographs. Her hair was long, tangled, her nightdress torn and blackened at the hem. She wasn't crying anymore. She just watched me, her expression calm, almost curious. In her small hand, she held a piece of burnt paper. I recognized it. A page from my old report, the one where I'd written "No surviving family found." The firelight flickered across her face. For the first time, I saw her clearly. Her eyes weren't dark as I'd thought before. They were pale gray, the same shade as my own. That was when I understood the house wasn't haunted by her. It was built from what I'd done to her. The rooms, the whispers, the shifting walls, they were all fragments of the night I'd buried. The place wasn't trapping me, it was holding me accountable. The girl took a step closer. Her lips moved, though I still couldn't hear. Then for the briefest second, I felt her hand in mine, small, cold, weightless. The fire collapsed around us. The floor fell away, and I was standing back outside in the clearing, snow falling again. The door was gone, the foundation silent. Only my footprints led back to the house in the distance. It looked smaller now, almost fragile. Its windows dark, its whispers quiet. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt hollow. Somewhere beneath the snow, beneath the ruins and memories, something had finally gone still, but not gone, never gone, because as I turned to leave, I saw her again. Not in the woods, not in the house, but reflected faintly in the surface of the ice forming on the pond. Watching, waiting. And though the air was still, I could swear I heard it again, faint as breath on glass. You left me here. The echo followed me all the way back to the house. I sat at the kitchen table until morning. I didn't move, didn't think. The world outside the window faded from black to gray, but it didn't feel like a new day. It felt like the same night, stretching itself thin across time, refusing to end. The house was quiet now, unnaturally so. No creaks, no hums, not even the sound of wind pressing against the windows. I realized then that silence could be worse than noise. Noise at least meant life. Silence felt like anticipation. On the table lay the old notebook I'd carried since my retirement. Its pages were warped, the ink bled from moisture. I turned through them, half expecting more words to appear in handwriting that wasn't mine. But everything inside was in my script: case notes, sketches, fragments of things I couldn't let go of. I stopped on one page that hadn't been there before. I knew every mark in that book, but this one was new. The date written at the top was February 8, 1984, the night of the fire. Beneath it, a line in my own handwriting: child declared deceased. No remains recovered. That was impossible. The report had said nothing about a missing body. I had written it myself. I would have remembered. But the ink on this page was aged, faded evenly across the lines, as though it had been written decades ago. I closed the notebook and looked around the kitchen. The morning light fell pale and flat, but something about it felt staged, like it was only pretending to be daylight. My reflection in the window didn't move quite in time with me. For a heartbeat, I saw the child's face over mine. I decided I needed answers, real ones, not memories, not hallucinations, not whatever the house was feeding me. I put on my coat and headed for town. The drive was short, but the road looked wrong. The snow was too clean, the telephone poles too evenly spaced. When I passed the old sign for the township, the letters looked fresh painted, though I knew no one had maintained it in years. I caught myself checking the clock on the dash, but the hands weren't moving. I didn't trust what I saw anymore. At the county records office, the clerk on duty was a young man I didn't recognize. I gave him the name: Maren House, Structure Fire, February 1984. He looked it up in silence, the faint hum of the microfilm machine filling the air. After a while he frowned. He said there was no record of any such incident. No fire, no deaths, nothing. The property didn't even appear in county logs until 1993. Before that, it was listed as farmland, no structures. I asked him to check again. He did, same result. I thanked him, though I didn't remember walking out. Outside, the sky had turned overcast. Snow began to fall again, fine and dry. I sat in my truck for what felt like hours, staring at my own reflection in the windshield. The man who looked back at me didn't seem convinced he existed. When I finally started the engine and headed home, the landscape had changed. The turnoff that led to the house wasn't where it should have been. I drove past it 3 times before I saw it, half hidden, narrower than I remembered. The snow along the road was undisturbed except for one faint trail of footprints leading inward, small footprints. Bare. The house came into view slowly, rising through the fog. From a distance, it looked like it had before run down but real. As I got closer, the details shifted. The porch railings looked new. The shutters were freshly painted. The front steps had no snow on them, though it had been falling steady all afternoon. And from the chimney, a thin column of smoke rose into the gray sky. I knew I hadn't lit a fire. Inside, the air was warm. The smell of burning wood filled the rooms, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt inhabited. I stepped into the living room, and the floor creaked the way it used to before the boards warped. On the mantel sat a row of framed photographs, clean, uncracked, unburned. One showed a man and woman standing in front of the house. Their faces were clear now. I recognized them. The husband had been the suspect in the original case. the wife, the victim, and between them, holding their hands, was the girl. Her eyes weren't hollow this time. She was smiling. I looked closer and saw that the man in the photo wasn't the suspect at all. It was me. The photo slipped from my hand and fell to the floor. The glass didn't break, it simply vanished before it hit. I stumbled back toward the kitchen, heart hammering. The table was gone. The windows looked out onto nothing, just a pale void where the snow should have been. My own breath came in clouds, though I no longer felt the cold. I turned toward the hall and froze. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, barefoot, her dress still singed at the hem. The same as before, but now she wasn't looking through me. She was looking at me. The silence stretched until I could hear my pulse in my ears. Then quietly she raised her hand and pointed to the wall behind me. I turned. The wallpaper had peeled away to reveal something painted beneath it, lines, shapes, symbols. They looked like floor plans at first, but they weren't of this house. They were maps. The property, the woods, and something buried beneath the foundation. A square chamber marked in red. I stepped closer. The walls began to tremble. Dust fell from the ceiling. Somewhere deep below I heard a door open. The sound was faint but distinct, the same door I'd found in the clearing. The one that shouldn't exist. The girl's voice came again, this time closer, more cert. I didn't hear it with my ears. It was inside my head, low and calm, as if she were right behind my eyes. You buried it. The house shuddered, and a deep cracking sound split the floorboards. The air grew heavy with the scent of wet earth. I didn't run, not this time. I knew where it wanted me to go. I opened the cellar door and started down. The stairs went deeper than they should have, the light fading fast behind me. My boots sank into mud instead of concrete. The air thickened, colder but alive, like the inside of a breathing creature. At the bottom, my flashlight flickered on again, though I hadn't touched it. The beam fell across something half buried in the soil. A shape wrapped in cloth, small and human. I knelt beside it. My hands shook as I brushed away the dirt. The fabric was old, brittle, burned in places. Beneath it was the faint outline of a skull no larger than a child's. The whisper returned, barely audible now. Now you remember. I couldn't breathe. The cold pressed against my chest, my lungs refusing to fill. The weight of 30 years settled in all at once. Every sleepless night, every unsolved case, every whisper I dismissed, it had all been leading here. The truth wasn't supernatural. It was far worse. I hadn't lost the child in the fire. I'd hidden her afterward, covered the evidence, rewritten the report, convinced myself I'd saved her when all I'd done was erase her. And now the house, the whispering, living, breathing house, had rebuilt itself from my lie. The walls began to close in, the ceiling dripping with moisture, the hum rising until it drowned everything else out. The air filled with the sound of my own heartbeat, deep and rhythmic, until I realized it wasn't mine. It was hers. I turned toward the stairs, but they were gone. Only darkness above me, thick and infinite. Then, faintly from somewhere beyond that dark, came her voice again, not accusing this time, almost kind. You can rest now. And with that, the light went out. When I woke, the air was different, thicker, humid, and laced with the faint scent of iron and decay. For a long time I couldn't tell if I was breathing water or air. The light around me was dim and bluish, like the kind that filters through deep water when the sun is far above. I tried to sit up, but my limbs were heavy, as though something invisible pressed down on me. The floor beneath my hands felt soft and damp, not wood anymore, but earth. Cold, wet, shifting slightly, as if it were alive. The cellar was flooded. I could see the reflection of the beams above rippling faintly, distorted by a thin layer of water. It was only a few inches deep, but it stretched across the entire space, shimmering with movement that didn't belong to me. Every time I blinked, it seemed to pulse gently, breathing in rhythm with the sound that still filled the air. That low, constant hum, the heartbeat of the house. My flashlight lay a few feet away, half submerged. It flickered weakly, the light scattering across the water's surface, revealing glimpses of things buried beneath: shoes, toys, bits of burnt fabric, all the remnants of what I'd hidden. I realized then that the house hadn't built itself from my guilt. It had been feeding on it, growing stronger each time I tried to deny what I'd done. It didn't want revenge, it wanted memory. To be remembered was its only form of survival. I tried to stand, but the mud clung to my boots. My reflection stared back at me from the water, blurred, almost unrecognizable. Behind it faintly another face appeared. The girl, pale still, her hair floating around her like smoke. I didn't look away. I couldn't. Her eyes opened beneath the water. Gray, familiar, not accusing this time but searching. I knelt down, hand trembling, and reached toward the surface. It rippled around my fingertips. The reflection changed again. Now I wasn't seeing the girl. I was seeing myself years younger in the same cellar, digging through the dirt with bare hands. My breath came fast and ragged, the same way it had that night. I was speaking, though I couldn't hear the words. My hands worked feverishly, desperate. I wasn't burying her. I was trying to get to her, but I hadn't been fast enough. I watched as the younger me stopped digging. His shoulders sagged, and he pressed his hands to his face. When he stood, his expression wasn't anger, it was surrender. He looked around, saw the flames above, and made a decision to rewrite it, to erase the failure, to build something else from the wreckage. The house wasn't punishment. It was my attempt to preserve what I couldn't accept, a monument built from denial and unfinished grief. I had trapped myself in it decades ago, and now it was all that was left. The reflection of the girl drifted closer. Her hand rose from beneath the surface and rested against mine, separated only by the thinnest layer of water. For the first time since all this began, the whisper wasn't a voice at all, it was a feeling. Calm, forgiving. Then the water began to rise, slowly at first, then faster. It reached my knees, then my waist. The hum grew louder, shaking the wall. I could hear the house straining, the beams groaning under pressure. The air turned metallic, thick with the smell of rust. I tried to find the stairs, but there were none. The walls had closed around me again, the space shrinking. The ceiling dripped steadily, each drop sending concentric ripples across the rising surface. When the water reached my chest, I stopped fighting. There was nowhere left to go. My flashlight sputtered out, leaving only the faint blue glow from beneath. I looked down one last time. The girl's face was gone. In her place was my own reflection, perfectly still, eyes closed, at peace. The hum quieted. The house exhaled, then came a stillness deeper than silence. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing outside. The snow had stopped. The house loomed behind me, whole and untouched, as if it had never burned, never decayed, never changed. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney. The windows were warm with light. I could hear laughter inside, soft, distant, human. For a fleeting moment, I thought I might walk back in. Pretend none of it had happened. Pretend I still lived here. But when I looked down, there were no footprints behind me. Not in the snow, not anywhere. The house stood quiet, waiting, and then from somewhere deep inside, the whisper came again. Faint but not pleading this time. You can go now. I turned toward the woods. The air was cold and clean. The morning light broke through the trees like something new. I walked until the house disappeared from view, and for the first time in 30 years, the silence didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like release. The road looked the same as it always had, long, narrow, lined with skeletal trees that reached over it like arms. But there was something off about the light, too even, too colorless. It wasn't dawn or afternoon. It was something in between, a gray that refused to deepen or fade. I walked for miles before realizing I couldn't hear my footsteps. The snow gave no sound beneath me. When I looked back, the road behind me was unmarked, smooth, untouched. I stopped. The air didn't move. There was no wind, no birds, no far-off hum of engines. Only a silence that felt designed. For a moment, I wondered if this was what peace felt like. Then I remembered peace was supposed to have warmth in it. This didn't. This was sterile, suspended, like being kept alive in something that wasn't life. I reached the crossroads where the county road met the old state highway. The sign was still there, rusted, half-buried, but the lettering was new, sharp, and clean. Maren Township, 2 miles. I'd never seen it spelled that way. The old one had read Maren. A single letter shouldn't have meant anything, but I knew it did. The world I'd stepped into wasn't the same one I'd left. It was a copy, a memory of the world built from fragments the house had kept. I started toward the highway. My truck wasn't where I'd left it. In its place stood a single mailbox, newer than anything else around. The name on it stopped me cold. Detective R.H. Maren, my name, but not how I spelled it. The same small shift. Maren had become Maren. The snow began to fall again, soft, almost hesitant. I brushed some from the mailbox and lifted the lid. Inside was a single envelope, sealed in yellowing paper, edges curled, my handwriting unmistakable. The postmark was from 1984. I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. The ink had faded, but the words were legible. If you're reading this, you found your way out, but you didn't leave. You can't. This place is what you made to survive what you did. Don't look for time here. It doesn't pass. It remembers. And it remembers you. No signature. Just that. The wind picked up for the first time in hours, sharp and biting, carrying with it the faintest smell of smoke. When I looked up, I saw it again, the plume rising from the house's chimney in the distance, steady and unwavering. I turned away, walked faster. The road wound through the trees, down toward what should have been town. But where I expected the first gas station or old diner, there was nothing. Just flat, open snowfields stretching to the horizon. A place uninhabited, unfinished. I walked until the gray light began to thin. My legs burned, my breath froze in front of me, but the road never changed. Then faintly I heard something, not the hum, not the whisper, a sound I hadn't heard in years, a radio. I followed it through the snow until I found the source. A small patrol car parked half buried near the side of the road, its roof antenna still intact. The door hung open. The logo on the side was half faded but clear enough. County Sheriff, Maren Division. I leaned inside. The seats were coated in frost. The radio crackled with static. A voice broke through, warped and faint, as if underwater. Requesting status on fire response. Repeat. The Maren house is fully involved. The words hit like a blow. My hands gripped the doorframe. The broadcast looped again, exactly the same. No variation, no time gap, just the same 30 seconds on repeat. A distress call from decades ago, echoing endlessly through a frequency no one was left to answer. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the microphone. The air inside the car was freezing, the steering wheel rhymed with ice. I picked up the receiver and pressed the button. Nothing. The static didn't even shift. And then I saw it, the rearview mirror, angled slightly upward. In its reflection, the road behind me wasn't empty anymore. The house was there, closer than it should have been. Its windows glowed orange again, firelight flickering inside. I turned. The road was empty. Turned back to the mirror. The house was there still, unmoving, eternal. I stepped out of the car, my breath coming faster now. The air had thickened again, the same pressure that filled the cellar, the same hum beneath the skin. The horizon blurred. The snow stopped falling midair, frozen in place like dust caught in amber. And somewhere behind me, just out of sight, came the faint sound of footsteps. Small ones, not running this time, just walking, steady, purposeful. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew whose they were. The hum grew softer. Almost tender now, like a lullaby played through walls. The air shimmered once and the world rearranged itself. I was standing back at the edge of the property again. The chimney still smoked. The door hung open, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there. Time didn't feel like a thing anymore. Eventually, I walked up the steps and crossed the threshold. The house greeted me with warmth, the faint scent of pine, firewood, and something sweet. From upstairs came the sound of a lullaby being hummed, soft and steady. I didn't go up. I didn't need to. I understood now that this was all there was. The house, the road, the memory, looping forever like the radio call in the patrol car. I sat by the fireplace. The flames burned low, blue at the edges. Somewhere behind me the whisper came one last time. You came back, and for once I didn't feel afraid. I closed my eyes. The hum faded. The snow outside stopped falling, and the house at last stopped whispering. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not silence, but quiet, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that listens back. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, though I couldn't recall ever seeing the flames die. The room was colder now, but the cold didn't bite. It was the kind that seeps in, becomes part of you like a second skin. I sat there for what felt like hours, though there was no clock, no shift in light to measure by. The air was gray again, that same unbroken hue. The edges of the room began to blur, as if the world had grown tired of holding its shape. For the first time I realized I wasn't breathing. I tried, forced the motion, but the chest didn't rise. There was no air to pull in. No heartbeat in my ears. Only the soft, steady rhythm of something deeper, slower, the hum. It came again, softer than before, familiar, almost soothing. I'd heard it for weeks or years, but this time I understood it. It wasn't coming from the walls. It wasn't from beneath the floorboards or the cellar. It was coming from me. I stood, and the house seemed to shift with me. The boards creaked not from weight, but from recognition. Each step I took matched another sound, the low groan of wood, the faint whisper of dust falling through the beams. I'd walked these halls before, in every direction, in every version of time. And each time the house had been waiting. I passed through the kitchen, where the wallpaper had peeled itself into shapes I almost recognized, faces or maybe memories. The kettle sat cold on the stove, the same dent in its side from that first night. I reached out to touch it, but my hand passed through. The motion stirred the air, but I felt nothing. I moved to the staircase. The same broken step halfway up. The same sound it made when I pressed my weight onto it, though now there was no weight at all. At the top, the hallway stretched into shadow. I remembered the first time I climbed these stairs, flashlight trembling, heart pounding against the ribs. I thought something waited at the end. I was wrong. The waiting thing had always been the house itself. The door to the nursery was open now. Inside, the walls were covered with faint handprints, small and overlapping. The window was fogged from the inside, but the fog didn't move when I breathed, because I couldn't. On the crib sat the old tape recorder, the one I'd found years ago with the final log. It was running. The wheels turned, though there was no tape inside. I listened, and for the first time I heard the whisper clearly. It wasn't speaking to me, it was speaking as me. Every thought I'd had, every reflection I'd made since stepping into this house, they weren't memories at all. They were echoes. The house remembering the man who'd lived within it, replaying the story like an old recording that refused to end. That was why I could never leave, why every road led back here. I wasn't walking through the house anymore, the house was walking through me. I looked down at my hands, and they were fading, edges dissolving into the same muted air that filled every room. The body was unimportant now. The mind too. What mattered was the residue, the memory that held shape. I turned toward the mirror on the wall. There was no reflection, only faint ripples as though glass had become water. Behind the surface, shapes moved, shadows of others. Some I recognized, some I didn't. They were all here, every person who had ever been part of this story. The child, the mother, the stranger in the cellar. The detective who came to understand too late that the house wasn't a place, but a container, a vessel for everything left unresolved. I stepped closer. The surface gave way like mist. The air inside was warmer, softer, as if welcoming me home. For a moment I saw the world outside again, snow falling gently, the sky a pale gray dome. The house stood quiet, smoke curling from its chimney. To anyone passing by it would look abandoned, just another ruin among many, but inside it was alive. Breathing, remembering, and if someone new ever came, another detective, another lost soul chasing something they'd never name, the house would open its doors once more. It would listen, it would whisper, it would make them remember too. The hum rose one last time, low and resonant, until it became everything. The walls, the air, the thought, the self, and then there was no distinction between them. There was only the house, and the house remembered.